The silence in the mountain cabin had been absolute for so long that Lydia Novak had forgotten what music sounded like. And when the massive, bearded stranger appeared at her isolated homestead carrying nothing but a worn saddlebag and a rifle nearly as tall as she was, the last thing she expected was that he would change everything about the quiet, joyless existence she had carved out in the wilderness of northern New Mexico territory in the spring of 1878. Her husband had been dead for 3 years, taken by a rockslide while hunting in the higher elevations, leaving her alone with their small cabin, a struggling vegetable garden, and memories that grew fainter with each passing season. At 24 years old, Lydia had resigned herself to a life of solitary survival, speaking only to the occasional trader who passed through, or the Jicarilla Apache woman who sometimes brought her herbs in exchange for tobacco. She had been 19 when Thomas married her back in Kansas, full of dreams about their new life in the territories, and 21 when those dreams died along with him under tons of mountain stone. The stranger introduced himself as Lucas Kerrigan, and he was the most imposing man Lydia had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the doorway of her cabin when he knocked that April morning. His hair hung past his collar in dark brown waves, and his arms, visible beneath rolled shirt sleeves despite the mountain chill, were corded with muscle that spoke of years hauling traps, chopping wood, and surviving in country that killed weaker men without mercy. His beard was thick and well kept, and his eyes were the color of summer storms, gray and watchful and surprisingly kind when he asked if she might spare some salt and coffee in exchange for fresh meat. "I have venison," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "Took a buck yesterday up near Eagle Creek, more than I can use before it spoils, even with smoking." Lydia hesitated, her hand tight on the door frame. She was not accustomed to visitors, especially not men who looked like they could snap her in half without effort. But his eyes were steady and honest, and she desperately needed the meat. Her traps had yielded nothing but one scrawny rabbit in the past 2 weeks. "I can spare some coffee," she said quietly. "Salt too, if the meat is good." Lucas smiled, transforming his rugged features into something almost gentle. "It is good, madam. I will bring it around." He was true to his word, returning within the hour with a haunch of venison so fresh it was still warm, wrapped in clean canvas. Lydia traded him the coffee and salt, and he tipped his hat to her before turning to leave. But then he paused, glancing back at the cabin, at the sagging roof that needed repairs, at the woodpile that was far too small for someone living alone. "You manage this place by yourself?" he asked. "I do," Lydia said, lifting her chin despite the defensive flutter in her stomach. "Have been for 3 years now." Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping across the homestead with what looked like professional assessment. "You have done well. This is hard country for anyone, harder still alone." Something in his tone was not pity but genuine respect, and Lydia felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "I have a camp about 5 miles north of here," Lucas said. "Up in the high country. If you ever need anything, you can find me there. Or leave a marker at the split pine near the creek. I check it regular when I am in the area." Lydia nodded, uncertain what to say. The kindness felt foreign, almost suspicious, but his expression remained open and sincere. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Lucas shrugged his massive shoulders. "Because it is right. No one should be alone out here without someone knowing they exist." He left then, striding away into the timber with the easy, powerful gait of a man utterly comfortable in the wilderness. Lydia watched him go, holding the venison against her chest, and realized her heart was beating faster than it had in years. Over the following weeks, Lucas appeared at irregular intervals, always with some excuse. He brought her fish from the mountain streams, helped her repair the worst of the roof damage, and showed her how to set her traps more effectively. Lydia found herself listening for his footsteps, watching the tree line for his approach, and she scolded herself for the foolishness even as she carefully braided her hair each morning instead of simply tying it back. Lucas was unfailingly respectful, never pushing beyond the boundaries of neighborly assistance, but Lydia began to notice the way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name, the way he always positioned himself between her and any potential danger, even if that danger was just a startled elk crashing through the undergrowth. One evening in late May, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Lucas asked her about her life before the territory. Lydia found herself talking more than she had in years, telling him about Kansas, about her family, about the small church where she had sung in the choir every Sunday. "You sang?" Lucas asked, his interest sharpening. "You have a music background?" Lydia shook her head. "Nothing formal. Just church songs. My mother taught me when I was young. She said music was the language of joy, that it could lift the spirit when nothing else would." Her voice grew quieter. "I have not sung in a long time, not since Thomas died." It felt wrong somehow, making music when there was nothing to be joyful about. Lucas was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkening peaks. "That is a hard way to live," he finally said, "without joy." "It is the only way I know anymore," Lydia admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Everything here is about survival. There is no room for anything else." Lucas turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "There should be room," he said firmly. "You deserve more than just surviving, Lydia." The way he said her name, rough and gentle all at once, made something deep inside her chest crack open. She looked away quickly, afraid of what he might see in her face, afraid of the sudden fierce longing that surged through her. Lucas left soon after, but Lydia could not stop thinking about his words. She lay awake that night, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, remembering what it felt like to sing, to dance, to feel something other than the grinding monotony of daily survival. And she thought about Lucas, about the quiet strength in his hands, the kindness in his eyes, the way he seemed to see her as a person rather than just another piece of the harsh landscape. What Lydia did not know was that Lucas rode back to his mountain camp that night with his mind spinning, already formulating a plan that would require more courage than facing down a grizzly bear. He had been alone for most of his 31 years, trapping and hunting in the wildest parts of the territory, content with his solitary existence. But Lydia had changed something fundamental in him. Her quiet resilience, her beauty that shone through despite the hardship, her obvious loneliness that matched his own, it all combined to create a feeling he had never experienced before. He wanted to make her smile. More than that, he wanted to make her happy, to bring light back into those dark blue eyes that held so much hidden sorrow. And he remembered what she had said about music, about joy, about dancing in her youth. Lucas Kerrigan had never played a musical instrument in his life, but he was a man accustomed to teaching himself whatever skills survival demanded. If he could learn to track a mountain lion through bare rock, if he could learn to read weather patterns in the shape of clouds, if he could learn a dozen different ways to survive where most men would perish, then by God, he could learn to play music. The problem was acquiring an instrument. The nearest real town was Fort Sumner, more than 80 miles southeast across some of the most unforgiving country in New Mexico territory. But Lucas had traded furs there before, and he knew a man who ran a general store that sometimes had unusual items shipped up from Santa Fe. 3 days later, Lucas rode out before dawn, telling himself he was a fool but unable to shake the image of Lydia's face lighting up if he could actually pull this off. The journey took him 4 days of hard riding, navigating through high desert, across rivers swollen with snowmelt, and past Comanche territory where he had to move carefully to avoid unwanted attention. Fort Sumner was a rough settlement built around the old Army fort, a collection of adobe buildings and false-fronted wooden structures that served ranchers, traders, and anyone else brave or desperate enough to make a life on the frontier. Lucas sold his latest batch of furs to a trader he trusted, then made his way to McDonald's general store. James McDonald was a Scotsman who had somehow ended up in New Mexico territory after a series of adventures he liked to recount over whiskey. He raised his bushy eyebrows when Lucas explained what he wanted. "A fiddle," McDonald said, scratching his beard. "That is an unusual request from you, Kerrigan. Did not take you for a musical man." "I am not," Lucas admitted, "but I need to learn. You have one or not?" McDonald studied him for a long moment, then his weathered face broke into a knowing grin. "Ah, there is a woman involved. Has to be. Nothing else would make a mountain man come all this way for a fiddle." Lucas felt heat rise in his face but kept his expression neutral. "Can you help me or not?" "As it happens, I might be able to," McDonald said, moving to a back room. He returned carrying a battered case. Had this come in 3 months ago, part of an estate sale down Santa Fe way. Fellow who owned it died without family and his possessions got scattered. It is not fancy, but it is functional. He opened the case to reveal a violin that had clearly seen better days. The wood was scuffed and one of the tuning pegs looked slightly loose, but the strings were intact, and when McDonald plucked one experimentally, it produced a clear tone. "How much?" Lucas asked. They haggled for 20 minutes, but Lucas eventually walked out with the fiddle, a bow that needed new rosin, and a small instruction book that McDonald threw in as a bonus. The Scotsman also directed him to a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who had once been a music teacher back east, and might be willing to give him some basic lessons in exchange for work around her property. Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a formidable woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She looked Lucas up and down when he appeared at her small adobe house on the edge of town. "You want to learn the violin," she said flatly. "You, a mountain man who probably has not heard a symphony in his entire life." "Yes, madam," Lucas said, holding his ground despite her withering stare. "And I need to learn fast. I can pay you with work. Your roof needs patching, your well needs a new cover, and that fence is about to fall over." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "Why the urgency? What is driving this sudden musical ambition?" Lucas met her gaze steadily. "There is a woman who used to love music. She has forgotten how to find joy in anything. I want to remind her." Something shifted in Mrs. Patterson's expression. Her stern features softened almost imperceptibly. "Well," she said, "that is the best reason I have heard in quite some time. Come inside, Mr. Kerrigan. We have work to do, and I warn you, I am not a patient teacher." For the next 3 weeks, Lucas remained in Fort Sumner, spending his mornings and evenings working on Mrs. Patterson's property and his afternoons learning the fundamentals of the violin. It was the most frustrating thing he had ever attempted. His large, calloused hands felt clumsy on the delicate instrument, and the sounds he initially produced were closer to a cat being strangled than anything resembling music. Mrs. Patterson was indeed not patient, but she was effective. She drilled him on proper posture, on how to hold the bow, on the basic fingering positions, and on simple scales that seemed impossible at first but gradually became less torturous. She taught him to read basic musical notation, showed him how to tune the instrument by ear, and most importantly, helped him understand that music was not just technical precision but emotion and feeling. "You play from here," she said one afternoon, tapping her chest above her heart, "not just from your fingers. Music is about what you feel, what you want to communicate. Technical perfection means nothing if there is no soul behind it." Lucas practiced until his fingers bled, wrapped them, and practiced more. He worked through the frustration when the bow slipped or the notes came out scratchy and wrong. He forced his mind to grasp the patterns of the instruction book, learning simple folk tunes that misses. Patterson insisted were the foundation of everything else. "If you can play a simple waltz, a reel, and a ballad," she told him, "you can make someone happy. That is all music needs to do, make someone feel something." By the end of 3 weeks, Lucas could play several basic tunes without making listeners wince. He would never be a virtuoso, but he could produce recognizable melodies with reasonable tone quality, and Mrs. Patterson finally declared him competent enough not to embarrass himself. "The woman you are doing this for is very fortunate," Mrs. Patterson said on his last day, watching him carefully pack the violin. "Most men would buy flowers or jewelry. You are giving her something far more valuable. You are giving her a piece of yourself, vulnerability and effort and pure intention." Lucas felt his throat tighten. "I just want to see her smile," he said quietly. "Really smile like she means it." "Then I suspect you will," Mrs. Patterson said. "Now go, before I get sentimental and ruin my reputation as a cantankerous old woman." The ride back north to the high country took Lucas 3 days, pushing hard but being careful not to damage the violin case strapped securely to his saddle. His heart pounded harder the closer he got to Lydia's homestead, nerves and anticipation mixing into something that felt almost like fear. What if she thought he was ridiculous? What if this grand gesture fell flat? What if she did not feel the same pull he felt every time he looked at her? But Lucas had not survived this long in the wilderness by backing down from challenges, and he was not about to start now. He stopped at his own camp first, cleaning up and changing into his better shirt, the one without patches. He practiced one more time, playing through the simple waltz that misses. Patterson had assured him was perfect for dancing. Then, with the violin case in hand and his heart hammering against his ribs, he made his way down the mountain to Lydia's cabin. It was early evening, the June air warm and sweet with pine scent. Lydia was outside tending her garden when he approached, and she looked up with obvious pleasure when she saw him. "Lucas," she said, rising and brushing dirt from her skirt. "I was beginning to worry. You have been gone for weeks." "I had some business to attend to," Lucas said, suddenly feeling foolish standing there with the violin case like some traveling minstrel. "Down in Fort Sumner." Lydia's eyes dropped to the case, curiosity flickering across her features. "What is that?" Lucas took a breath, trying to calm the unusual nervousness that made his hands want to shake. "I remembered what you said, about music, about how you used to sing and dance and how you have not had any joy in a long time." He paused, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I thought maybe it was time you did." He opened the case before he could lose his nerve, revealing the violin nestled inside. Lydia's expression went utterly still, her eyes widening. "You bought a violin," she whispered. "Not just bought," Lucas said. "I learned to play. Not well, mind you. Not like a professional or anything close, but enough to play you a few songs if you would like." Lydia stared at him as if he had just sprouted wings. "You learned to play," she repeated slowly. "For me?" "Yes," Lucas said simply. The vulnerability in her voice, the disbelief and wonder mixing together, made his chest ache. "I wanted to give you something you could not give yourself out here. Music. Dancing. something joyful. Lydia's hand came up to cover her mouth, and Lucas saw her eyes suddenly shine with tears. "I do not understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Why would you do something like that? Learning an instrument takes months, years even. 3 weeks of intensive lessons from a very stern former music teacher," Lucas admitted. "And I am not good, Lydia, I want to be clear about that. But I can play well enough to give you what you have been missing, if you will let me." A tear slipped down Lydia's cheek, and she brushed it away quickly, looking almost angry with herself for the display of emotion. "No one has ever done anything like this for me," she said. "Not ever." Lucas set the case down carefully and stepped closer, his large hands gentle when he reached out to touch her shoulder. "Then people have been fools," he said quietly. "You deserve every good thing, Lydia. Music and joy and so much more." "I do not know what to say," Lydia whispered, looking up at him with those dark blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Say you will listen," Lucas said. "Say you will dance if the music moves you. That is all I am asking." Lydia nodded, unable to speak, and Lucas carefully lifted the violin from its case. His hands were steadier now, purpose overriding nervousness. He tucked the instrument under his chin the way Mrs. Patterson had taught him, positioned the bow, and took a moment to make sure it was properly tuned. Then he began to play. The melody was simple, a folk waltz that Mrs. Patterson had selected specifically for its flowing, romantic quality. Lucas's playing was not perfect. There were a few scratchy notes, a slight hesitation in one transition, but the music was recognizable and genuine, pouring out into the mountain evening with surprising sweetness. Lydia stood frozen for the first few measures, her hands clasped in front of her chest, tears streaming freely down her face now. Then, as the melody continued, something extraordinary happened. Her body began to move, just slightly at first, swaying in time with the 3/4 rhythm. Her feet started to shift, remembering old patterns, and before she realized what she was doing, Lydia was dancing. It was not a formal dance, not structured or proper, just the natural movement of a body responding to music after years of silence. She turned slowly, her arms lifting, her skirt swirling around her legs, and her face transformed into something Lucas had never seen before: pure, unguarded joy. Lucas continued playing, watching her dance in the fading light, and he thought his heart might burst from the pressure of what he felt. This woman, who had survived so much alone, who had buried her capacity for happiness under the weight of grief and necessity, was smiling. Really smiling, exactly the way he had dreamed she would. When the waltz ended, Lucas transitioned into another tune, a livelier reel that made Lydia laugh out loud. The sound was so unexpected, so bright and alive, that Lucas nearly fumbled the notes. But he recovered, playing through the entire piece while Lydia spun and stepped and moved with increasing confidence, rediscovering the girl she had been before hardships stole her lightness. Finally, Lucas's fingers began to tire, and he drew the bow across the strings one last time before lowering the violin. Lydia slowed to a stop, breathing hard, her face flushed and radiant in the twilight. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken emotion. "Lucas," Lydia finally said, her voice raw, "I do not know how to thank you. I cannot even begin to express what this means to me." Lucas carefully set the violin back in its case before turning to face her fully. "Then do not try to express it," he said. "Just tell me one thing. Tell me if I am wrong about what I think exists between us. Because, Lydia, I did not really learn to play the fiddle just to make you smile, though God knows seeing you happy is worth every bit of effort. I learned because I am completely, terrifyingly in love with you, and I needed to find a way to show you what words could not. Lydia's breath caught audibly. "Lucas," she whispered. "I know I am just a mountain man," Lucas continued, the words tumbling out now that he had started. "I do not have much to offer except a hard life in rough country. But I swear to you, Lydia, if you would have me, I would spend every day trying to bring you joy. I would protect you, provide for you, and do everything in my power to make sure you never feel alone or forgotten again." "Stop," Lydia said, and Lucas's heart sank until he saw her expression. She was smiling through fresh tears, radiant and open and so beautiful it hurt to look at her. "You are not just a mountain man, Lucas Kerrigan. You are the kindest, most extraordinary person I have ever known. And I do not need time to think about this, because I have been falling in love with you since the first day you appeared at my door." The relief and joy that flooded through Lucas was so intense it left him dizzy. "You mean that?" he asked, needing to hear it again, needing to be absolutely certain. "Every word," Lydia said, stepping closer until she was near enough to touch. "I was terrified to hope for anything beyond survival, but you made me remember that there is more to life. You gave me music and laughter and the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me. How could I not love you?" Lucas reached out with trembling hands and cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "I am going to kiss you now," he said quietly, "if that is all right with you." "It is more than all right," Lydia breathed, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, a question and answer all at once. But then Lydia's arms came up around Lucas's neck and his wrapped around her waist, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of loneliness ended and future promises and passion long denied. Lucas was acutely aware of how small she felt in his arms, how delicate, and he held her with careful strength, as if she were something precious that might break. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words escaping before he could think them through. "I know it is fast, but I am certain about this, about you, about us." Lydia laughed, the sound bright and free. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Lucas, today, tomorrow, whenever you want. I do not need time to know this is right." They were married 3 weeks later in Fort Sumner, with Mrs. Patterson serving as a witness and James McDonnell standing up as Lucas's unofficial best man. It was a simple ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, but to Lydia and Lucas, it was perfect. Lydia wore a simple dress that Mrs. Patterson had altered for her, and Lucas had gotten a proper haircut and shave, though he kept the beard that Lydia admitted she loved. After the ceremony, Lucas played the violin again, there in McDonnell's store with chairs pushed back to make room. Several townspeople had gathered to witness the unusual mountain man wedding, and when Lucas drew the bow across the strings and began a waltz, he held out his hand to his new wife. Lydia took it without hesitation, and they danced together for the first time as husband and wife, moving in the simple patterns she taught him between songs. Lucas was not a natural dancer. His size made him feel clumsy despite his wilderness grace, but Lydia guided him patiently, and soon they were moving together with reasonable competence, lost in each other's eyes. "I could do this forever," Lydia said as they turned. "Dance with you, listen to you play, just be with you." "Then that is exactly what we will do," Lucas promised. "Forever." They spent their wedding night in a small but clean room above the general store, and Lucas was tender and patient with Lydia, understanding that Thomas had been her only other experience, and that this mattered deeply. He took his time learning what pleased her, what made her sigh and arch against him, and when they finally came together, it was with a sweetness and intensity that left them both shaken. Afterward, Lydia lay curled against Lucas's broad chest, tracing the scars and muscles with gentle fingers. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she admitted quietly. "Safe, cherished, happy." Lucas pressed a kiss to her hair. "You will feel that way every day for the rest of our lives," he vowed. "I swear it to you." They returned to the mountains as husband and wife, but they did not return to Lydia's old cabin. Instead, Lucas took her to his camp in the high country, where he had been preparing a surprise during the weeks before their wedding. He had expanded his simple shelter into a proper cabin with help from a few men he trusted, creating a home that was larger and sturdier than Lydia's old place, with real windows that had cost him most of his fur trading profits and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the brutal mountain winters. "You built this?" Lydia asked, staring at the cabin in amazement. "When? How?" "I had help," Lucas admitted. "And I started planning it the day I rode to Fort Sumner for the Fiddle. I knew I was going to ask you to marry me. I just had to find the courage to actually do it. I wanted us to have a real home, not just a survival shelter." Lydia turned to him with eyes bright with emotion. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is perfect." They settled into married life with surprising ease, their days falling into comfortable rhythms. Lucas taught Lydia how to track game more effectively, how to read the mountain weather, and how to defend herself if necessary. Lydia taught Lucas to read better. His skills were rudimentary from occasional lessons as a boy, and shared her knowledge of medicinal plants and cooking techniques that went beyond basic trail food. But the music became the centerpiece of their evenings together. Lucas continued practicing the violin, gradually improving under Lydia's encouragement, and she began to sing again, her voice blending with the instrument in ways that made the cabin feel enchanted. They learned new songs together from a book Mrs. Patterson had given them as a wedding gift, and sometimes they would dance by firelight, moving slowly in each other's arms while the mountain night pressed close around their warm sanctuary. One evening in late autumn, as the first snows began to dust the highest peaks, Lydia had news that made Lucas drop the firewood he was carrying. "I am with child," she said, her hands resting on her still flat stomach. "I am certain of it." Lucas crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground despite her laughing protests. "You are sure?" he demanded, his face split by a grin so wide it hurt. "As sure as I can be this early," Lydia confirmed. "By my reckoning, the baby should come sometime in early summer." Lucas set her down carefully as if she had suddenly become made of glass. "You need to rest," he said immediately. "Sit down. Put your feet up. Should you be standing?" "What do you need?" Lydia laughed and caught his hands. "I need you to stop panicking. I am pregnant, Lucas, not dying. Women have babies every day." "Not my woman," Lucas said fiercely. "Not carrying my child. This is different. This is important." "All babies are important," Lydia said gently, but she was touched by his protectiveness. "I will be careful, I promise. But I am not going to become an invalid for 9 months. We have too much to do to prepare." Lucas fussed over her constantly as the pregnancy progressed, driving Lydia to exasperation and laughter in equal measure. He insisted on doing all the heavy work, monitored what she ate with almost comical intensity, and worried obsessively about whether the cabin was warm enough, safe enough, good enough for a baby. But he also played the violin for her every evening, soothing music that he swore helped the baby grow healthy and strong. And he talked to her belly when he thought she was asleep, telling their unborn child stories about the mountains, and promising to be the best father he could possibly be. Winter came hard that year, with snowdrifts that reached the cabin windows and temperatures that made the inside walls frost over despite the roaring fireplace. But Lucas had prepared well. laying in massive stores of food and firewood, and they weathered the storms together, warm and safe in their mountain sanctuary. Lydia's belly grew round and prominent, and she found herself grateful beyond measure that she was not facing this pregnancy alone the way she would have if Thomas had lived and died on the same timeline. Lucas was there for every moment of discomfort, rubbing her swollen feet, supporting her back when it ached, and reassuring her when she woke from nightmares about childbirth going wrong. "You are the strongest woman I know," he told her one night after a particularly vivid bad dream. "You survived 3 years alone in country that would have broken most people. You will survive this too, and I will be right beside you the entire time." "I am more afraid than I thought I would be," Lydia admitted. "Women die in childbirth all the time, especially out here with no doctor for 100 miles. "You will not die," Lucas said with absolute conviction. "I will not allow it, and we are not completely without help. I sent word to Red Hawk Woman. She has agreed to come when your time is near. She has delivered dozens of babies and knows her craft well." Lydia felt some of her fear ease. Red Hawk Woman was the Jicarilla Apache healer who had befriended her years ago, a woman of tremendous skill and knowledge. "You asked her to come." "I asked, and I offered her every fur I have trapped this season as payment," Lucas said. "She agreed immediately. She remembers you with fondness and said she would be honored to help bring our child into the world." Tears pricked Lydia's eyes, the pregnancy making her emotions even more volatile than usual. "You think of everything," she whispered. "I think of you," Lucas corrected, kissing her forehead. "Always you and now our baby. That is all that matters." Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it brought an explosion of wildflowers and new growth that made the mountains look like something from a fairy tale. Lydia was enormous by then, uncomfortable and impatient, ready for the pregnancy to be over even though she was terrified of what came next. Red Hawk Woman arrived in early June, setting up in the cabin with calm efficiency and examining Lydia with expert hands. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with silver streaks in her long black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She spoke English well, learned from years of trading with settlers and soldiers, and her presence was immediately calming. "Your baby is strong," she told Lydia after the examination. "Positioned well. You are healthy. The birth will be hard, as all births are, but you will survive it." "You sound certain," Lydia said, wanting desperately to believe her. "I am certain," Red Hawk Woman said simply. "I have delivered many babies. I know when things are wrong. You and your child are right." Lucas hovered anxiously until Red Hawk Woman finally ordered him outside to chop wood or hunt or do anything useful that did not involve him pacing and radiating nervous energy. He went reluctantly, and Lydia could hear him outside attacking the woodpile with unusual ferocity. Her labor began 3 days later, starting with mild cramps that gradually intensified into waves of pain that took her breath away. Red Hawk Woman moved into action immediately, preparing the cabin, boiling water, laying out clean cloths and her various herbs and remedies. Lucas was allowed back inside but was given strict instructions to stay at Lydia's head, holding her hand and providing comfort, while Red Hawk Woman handled the actual delivery. The labor lasted through the day and into the night, a marathon of pain and effort that left Lydia exhausted and wondering how women ever agreed to do this more than once. Lucas never left her side, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement, letting her squeeze his hands hard enough to leave bruises. He played music during the calmer moments between contractions, soft melodies that helped her focus on something other than the pain. "I cannot do this," Lydia gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. "It is too much. I cannot." "You can," Lucas said fiercely, his gray eyes locked on hers. "You are doing it right now. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Lydia. Our baby is almost here, just a little longer." "He is right," Red Hawk Woman said from her position at the foot of the bed. "I can see the head. The next few pushes and your child will be born. You must push now with everything you have." Lydia bore down with a strength she did not know she possessed, her entire world narrowing to the single purpose of bringing her child into the world. Lucas held her shoulders, supporting her, his voice a constant stream of encouragement in her ear. One push, then another, then a third that tore a scream from her throat, and then suddenly, miraculously, there was a new sound in the cabin. A baby's cry, thin and outraged and absolutely perfect. "A son," Red Hawk Woman announced, holding up the squalling infant. "You have a strong, healthy son." Lydia collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face, while Red Hawk Woman quickly cleaned and swaddled the baby before placing him in her arms. Lydia stared down at the tiny, red-faced creature, overwhelmed by the force of her love for this person she had just met. "A boy," Lucas said, his voice choked with emotion. He reached out with one large, trembling finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand, and the infant immediately grasped it with surprising strength. "Look at him, Lydia. Look at what we made." "He is perfect," Lydia whispered, unable to look away from her son's face. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Benjamin Thomas Kerrigan, honoring Lydia's father and her first husband, and Lucas cried when she told him. "You do not have to do that," he said. "You do not have to honor Thomas for me." "I am not doing it for you," Lydia said gently. "I am doing it because Thomas was a good man who would have loved being a father, and he deserves to be remembered. But Benjamin will know who his real father is. He will know you, Lucas, the man who learned to play the fiddle just to make me smile." Lucas kissed her then, gentle and reverent, mindful of her exhaustion and the baby between them. "I love you," he said. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You and Benjamin, you are my entire world." Red Hawk Woman stayed for 2 weeks, helping Lydia recover and teaching her the intricacies of caring for a newborn. Lucas was a surprisingly natural father despite his nervousness, handling Benjamin with careful strength and infinite patience. He played the violin softly when the baby fussed, and to everyone's surprise, Benjamin would immediately calm, his tiny face turning toward the music as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He knows the fiddle," Lydia said, watching her son react to his father's playing. "He heard it while he was inside me. All those evenings you played while talking to him, he remembers." Lucas looked absolutely delighted by this observation. "My son, the music lover," he said proudly. "I will teach him to play when he is old enough." As Benjamin grew, he did indeed show a remarkable affinity for music. He would bounce and wiggle when Lucas played, and before he could walk, he was trying to grab for the violin, fascinated by the instrument that produced such wonderful sounds. Lucas and Lydia's life fell into new patterns, shaped around their son's needs but still centered on the love and music that had brought them together. They had 2 more children over the next 6 years. A daughter they named Emma Grace, who inherited her mother's dark blue eyes and her father's stubborn determination, was born when Benjamin was 2.5. And another son, Samuel Lucas, arrived 3 years after that, completing their family with his sunny disposition and ready laugh. Lucas expanded the cabin twice to accommodate their growing family, and he proved to be as devoted a father as Lydia had known he would be. He taught Benjamin and Emma to track and hunt, showed them the secret places in the mountains, and instilled in them a deep respect for the wilderness that was their home. But he also played music for them every single night, teaching them songs and encouraging them to sing along, and the cabin often rang with the sound of children's laughter and off-key melodies. Lydia taught all three children to read and write, using the books they accumulated through trading and occasional trips to Fort Sumner. She told them stories of their family history, making sure they knew about both their grandfathers, the one they would never meet and the one whose blood ran in their veins. She showed them how to identify medicinal plants, how to cook, and how to find beauty in even the harshest landscape. But most importantly, she made sure they understood that music and joy were not luxuries but necessities, that there was always room for dancing and singing no matter how hard life became. Because she never forgot those years of silence, those years when she had thought happiness was something that belonged to her past. And she never forgot the moment Lucas had appeared with a violin, offering her the most precious gift she had ever received. The gift of joy returned. Benjamin grew tall and strong like his father, showing an early aptitude for both wilderness skills and music. By the time he was 12, he could play the violin nearly as well as Lucas, and they would often play together, creating harmonies that made Lydia's heart swell with pride and happiness. Emma was more interested in her mother's healing knowledge, spending hours learning about plants and remedies from both Lydia and Red Hawk Woman, who visited regularly and had become like an honorary grandmother to the children. Samuel was the wild card, showing interest in everything and committing to nothing, but he had a gift for making people laugh and a kind heart that reminded Lydia of Lucas. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. First teeth and first words gave way to first hunts and first dances. The territory changed around them, becoming more settled, with new homesteads appearing in previously empty valleys and the wild, lawless nature of the frontier gradually giving way to something more civilized. Fort Sumner grew into a proper town, and the railroad pushed closer every year, bringing both opportunity and the end of an era. Lucas and Lydia watched these changes with mixed feelings. Part of them missed the untamed wilderness of their early years together, but they also recognized that stability and civilization offered their children opportunities that had not existed before. Schools, churches, doctors, regular trade, all things that made life easier and safer, especially for families. When Benjamin was 16, he announced his intention to attend a music school back east that he had heard about from a traveling musician passing through Fort Sumner. Lydia's first instinct was to say absolutely not, that he was too young to be so far away, but Lucas surprised her by supporting their son's ambition. "He has a real gift," Lucas told her when they discussed it privately. "More than just the skill I taught him, he has what Mrs. Patterson talked about, soul in his playing. He deserves the chance to develop that fully with proper teachers and opportunities we cannot give him here." "But he is only 16, Lydia protested, even though she knew Lucas was right. "And it is so far away." "He is the same age I was when I first went into the mountains alone," Lucas reminded her gently. "And you were only 19 when you traveled to the territory with Thomas. Our children are strong, Lydia. We raised them to be capable and independent. We have to trust that." So they sent Benjamin east with their blessing, enough money for tuition and expenses, and the violin that Lucas had bought all those years ago in Fort Sumner. Lydia cried for 3 days after he left, and Lucas held her through it all, understanding her grief even as he remained confident in their decision. Benjamin wrote regularly, his letters full of excitement about his studies and the amazing music he was hearing and learning. He came home every summer, taller and more polished each time, and he would play for the family, showing them what he had learned. Lucas would sit and listen with obvious pride, occasionally joining in when Benjamin played the old folk songs they had learned together. Emma surprised everyone by falling in love with the son of a rancher who had established himself in the lower valleys. Joshua was a good man, hardworking and respectful, and when he asked Lucas for Emma's hand in marriage when she was 19, Lucas gave his blessing after a long, serious conversation about his expectations for how his daughter should be treated. The wedding was held at the cabin, with half the territory seemingly in attendance. Lucas played the violin for his daughter's first dance as a married woman, and Lydia watched with tears streaming down her face, remembering her own wedding and the unexpected joy that had followed. Samuel proved to be a gifted businessman, despite his young age, recognizing opportunity in the changing territory and establishing a successful trading operation by the time he was 21. He split his time between Fort Sumner and the mountain cabin, bringing news and goods to his parents, and using their remote location as a base for trading with the Jicarilla Apache and other groups who still preferred dealing with people they trusted. As their children built their own lives, Lucas and Lydia found themselves alone again in their mountain sanctuary. The cabin that had once been bursting with noise and activity, suddenly quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than the oppressive silence Lydia had endured before Lucas entered her life. This was peaceful, comfortable, the quiet of two people so completely in tune with each other that words were often unnecessary. Lucas's hair had gone silver, though he remained as strong and vital as ever, and his face bore the deep lines of a life lived outdoors in harsh conditions. But his gray eyes still held the same kindness and intensity that had captured Lydia's heart, and his love for her had never wavered or diminished. Lydia had aged as well, with streaks of white in her dark hair and the permanent sun lines of a frontier woman. But she still moved with grace, still sang while she worked, and still danced with Lucas by firelight when he played the violin. They played music together almost every evening now, just the two of them. And sometimes Lydia would stop and just watch her husband, marveling that this incredible man had chosen her, had learned an entire instrument just to make her smile. The gesture still overwhelmed her when she let herself really think about it, the sheer devotion and effort it represented. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Lydia reached over and took Lucas's hand. "Do you remember the first time you played for me?" she asked, though she knew he did. They had revisited the memory countless times over the years. "I remember being terrified you would think I was a fool," Lucas admitted with a smile. "Standing there with that violin, barely able to play a decent tune, hoping you would not laugh at me." "I cried," Lydia said softly. "I cried because no one had ever done anything so purely kind and thoughtful for me before. You gave me back a part of myself I thought was dead. You gave me joy and music and hope and love, all wrapped up in a scratchy waltz played on a second-hand fiddle." Lucas lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I would do it again," he said. "Every day for the rest of my life, I would learn that fiddle just to see you smile the way you did that first evening. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." "I love you," Lydia said, the words as true and powerful as the first time she had spoken them. "More than I can ever properly express. You saved me, Lucas, not just from loneliness or hardship, but from a life without meaning or beauty or happiness." "We saved each other," Lucas corrected gently. "I was just existing before I met you, Lydia, surviving, like you said, but not really living. You gave me purpose and family, and a reason to build something instead of just wandering. You made me want to be better, to be worthy of you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade from the sky and the first stars appear. Then Lucas stood and offered his hand to Lydia with an exaggerated formal bow. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Kerrigan?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. Lydia laughed and accepted his hand, rising gracefully. "Always, Mr. Kerrigan, always." Lucas did not bother getting the violin this time. Instead, he hummed one of their favorite waltzes, and they danced slowly on the porch, moving in the patterns they knew by heart after decades together. His arms were strong around her, and her head rested perfectly against his chest, and they swayed together as the mountain night settled around them. This was their life, built on a foundation of music and love, and the kind of devotion that learned entire instruments just to bring joy to another person. It was not always easy frontier life, never was, but it was deeply, profoundly good. It was full of laughter and dancing and children who carried forward their parents' legacy of finding beauty, even in hardship. And every evening when Lucas picked up his violin and began to play, Lydia would smile, really smile, and sometimes she would dance, and sometimes she would just close her eyes and listen. But either way, she was happy. Completely, absolutely happy in a way she had once thought impossible. The music had brought them together, but it was the love behind the music that had sustained them through everything life could throw at frontier families. And as they grew old together in their mountain sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of the beautiful life they had built, neither of them ever forgot the moment when everything changed. The moment when a mountain man appeared with a fiddle and played a simple tune, and a lonely widow remembered what it meant to feel joy. Years continued to pass with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. Benjamin became a renowned musician, traveling across the country performing, but always returning home every summer without fail. He married a pianist he met in Boston, and they had 3 children who would spend their summers in the mountain cabin, learning wilderness skills from their grandfather and songs from both their father and Lucas. Emma and Joshua built a successful ranch in the valley, raising cattle and 5 children who were as wild and free as the land they grew up on. Emma never lost her interest in healing, becoming the closest thing to a doctor for 50 miles, and people would ride for days to seek her help when illness or injury struck. She credited her mother and Red Hawk Woman for everything she knew, and she passed that knowledge on to her own daughters. Samuel's trading business expanded until he was one of the most influential merchants in the territory. He married late, at 32, to a widow with 2 young children who he adopted as his own. They had one more child together, a daughter who Samuel doted on shamelessly, and he made sure all his children understood the value of both hard work and finding joy in simple things like music and laughter. Red Hawk Woman lived to a remarkable age, still visiting the cabin regularly, until she was well into her 80s. She passed peacefully one winter, surrounded by the extended family she had helped bring into the world, and they buried her in the mountains she had loved according to her people's traditions. Lydia grieved her deeply, having lost not just a friend but a mentor and the woman who had safely delivered all 3 of her children. Mrs. Patterson surprised them all by appearing at the cabin one summer when Lucas was 68. She was ancient by then, transported from Fort Sumner by Samuel, who had found her living in reduced circumstances after the general store where she rented a room had burned down. "I came to see what became of my most unusual student," she announced, looking Lucas up and down with those sharp eyes that age had not dimmed. "You wrote that you were still playing. I wanted to hear for myself." Lucas played for her that evening, joined by Benjamin, who was visiting with his family. The 2 men created harmonies that filled the cabin with sound so beautiful it made everyone present fall silent just to listen. When they finished, Mrs. Patterson was wiping tears from her weathered cheeks. "You did it," she told Lucas quietly. "You did exactly what you set out to do. You made someone happy through music, and you built an entire life around that initial act of love. I could not be more proud if you were my own son." Mrs. Patterson stayed with them for the remainder of her years, given the small room that had belonged to Emma, and treated as the honored family matriarch she had become. She taught Benjamin's children music theory, played piano when Samuel managed to transport an old upright to the cabin as a gift, and told stories about Lucas's early, terrible attempts at violin playing that made everyone laugh, including Lucas himself. "I sounded like a dying cat," he would agree cheerfully. "Possibly several dying cats. It was truly awful. But you persisted," Mrs. Patterson would always add. "That is what mattered. You had purpose and love driving you, and those are more powerful than any natural talent." She passed in her sleep 2 years after arriving at the cabin, and they buried her next to Red Hawk Woman in the mountain meadow that had become the family cemetery. Lucas played at her funeral, a beautiful piece she had taught him decades ago, and there was not a dry eye among the assembled family and friends. Lucas and Lydia grew old gracefully, their love deepening rather than fading with time. Lucas's hands developed arthritis that made playing the violin progressively more difficult and painful, but he refused to stop entirely. Even when his fingers would no longer cooperate for complex pieces, he could still manage simple melodies, and he played for Lydia almost every evening, their ritual unchanged by time or physical limitation. "You do not have to play if it hurts," Lydia would tell him, worried about the way he would flex his swollen fingers afterward. "It is worth the pain," Lucas would always respond. "I learned to play to make you smile, Lydia. That purpose has not changed just because I am old." When Lucas was 73, he suffered a fall while checking his trap lines, something he still did despite his children's protests that he should slow down. He broke his hip in the accident and was confined to bed for months while it healed. Lydia nursed him through it with patient devotion, and their children took turns staying at the cabin to help with the work Lucas could no longer do. During his recovery, Lucas fretted constantly about being unable to play for Lydia. His hands had been further damaged in the fall, and even after his hip healed, he could no longer manage the violin at all. The silence in their evenings felt wrong, incomplete, and Lucas grew quietly depressed despite Lydia's reassurances that it did not matter. Then Benjamin arrived for one of his visits and sat down beside his father's chair. "I have been thinking," he said. "You spent all those years playing for Mother. Maybe it is time I returned the favor. I can play for both of you now, so you can both enjoy the music together instead of one of you always being the performer." Lucas's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Every evening I am here," Benjamin promised. "And I will teach my children, and Emma's children, and Samuel's children. We will make sure there is always music in this cabin, always something for you both to dance to if you want, or just enjoy together. You started this tradition, Father. We will help you keep it alive." And that was exactly what happened. The grandchildren learned violin and piano and guitar, and there was always music in the cabin when family visited. Lucas and Lydia would sit together, her hand in his, listening to their grandchildren play the same songs Lucas had learned decades ago, along with new ones that the younger generation brought with them. Sometimes, when the music was particularly moving, Lucas would stand carefully and offer his hand to Lydia, and they would dance slowly. Their steps limited by age, but their love as evident as it had been 50 years earlier. The grandchildren would watch them with the kind of awe reserved for witnessing something truly special, and more than one of them would later tell stories about their grandparents who loved each other so much that Grandpa learned the fiddle just to make Grandma smile. Lucas Kerrigan passed away in his sleep at the age of 79. With Lydia beside him in the bed they had shared for nearly 5 decades. His last words, spoken just before he drifted off, were to tell Lydia that she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and that learning to play the violin for her remained the best decision of his entire life. Lydia grieved deeply, but not hopelessly. She had been truly blessed, she knew, to have found a love like Lucas after losing Thomas, to have built such a beautiful life in such harsh country, to have raised children and grandchildren who understood the value of music and joy and devotion. She lived another 7 years after Lucas's death, surrounded by family, and she never lost her smile or her love of dancing when her grandchildren played. On her deathbed at 86, surrounded by her 3 children and more grandchildren than she could easily count, Lydia asked Benjamin to play one more song. "The waltz," she said softly. "The one your father played for me that first evening. I want to hear it one last time." Benjamin played with tears streaming down his face, the old familiar melody filling the cabin one final time. And Lydia closed her eyes and smiled, really smiled, and those who were there swore they could almost see her dancing one last time before she took her final breath. They buried her next to Lucas in the mountain meadow, under the pines and aspens they had both loved. Benjamin played at her funeral just as Lucas had played at Mrs. Patterson's, and the entire extended family gathered to celebrate a life well lived and a love that had transcended everything else. The cabin remained in the family for generations, eventually becoming a kind of sacred place where family members would gather for reunions and special occasions. The violin that Lucas had bought in Fort Sumner in 1878 was preserved carefully, passed down through the family as a treasured heirloom. Sometimes, during gatherings, someone would carefully remove it from its case and play, and the oldest family members would tell the story again, the story of the mountain man who learned to play the fiddle, just to see a lonely widow smile and dance. It became a family legend, the kind of story that defined who they were and what they valued. Love and devotion and the willingness to learn entire new skills just to bring joy to another person. The story was told to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, preserving the memory of Lucas and Lydia and the extraordinary life they had built together in the mountains of New Mexico territory. And always, when the story was told, there would be music afterward. Someone would play the violin or piano or guitar, and someone else would sing. And if the evening was right and the family was gathered close, people would dance. Because that was the legacy Lucas and Lydia had left behind, not just their bloodline but a tradition of finding joy even in hardship, of choosing love and music and happiness no matter what challenges life presented. The world changed dramatically around the place where they had lived. The territory became a state, the frontier disappeared entirely, and the wild country they had known was tamed and civilized beyond recognition. But in that mountain meadow where Lucas and Lydia rested together, beneath a simple stone marker that read, "He played, she danced, they loved," the music continued. Generation after generation, the family gathered and played and remembered, keeping alive the story of how a mountain man's devotion had brought joy back into a widow's life, and how that single act of love had created a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. Because true love, the kind that learns instruments and builds cabins and raises children and faces down every hardship together, does not end when life ends. It echoes forward through time, carried in the stories we tell and the traditions we maintain and the music we continue to play. Lucas Kerrigan learned the fiddle to make Lydia Novak smile and dance, and in doing so, he created something that would bring smiles and dancing to countless others for generations to come. That was the real magic of what he had done, not just the immediate joy he brought to one lonely woman, but the enduring joy that spread outward like ripples on water, touching everyone who ever heard their story and understood what it meant to love someone so completely that you would do anything, learn anything, become anything, just to see them happy. And in the end, that was exactly what mattered most. Not the hardship or the struggles or the inevitable sorrows that come with being human, but the love that persisted through it all. The music that played on even when the musicians were long gone. The dance that continued in the hearts of everyone who remembered what Lucas and Lydia had built together in those mountains, and who chose to honor them by finding their own joy, their own music, their own reasons to smile and dance, and celebrate the extraordinary gift of being alive and loved.